Please give a warm catalyst welcome to Lee Gerrard-Barlow on Mesmerism.
The perennial philosophy seemed to be another northerner for some reason. Don't know why that is, but the perennial philosophy. That's something that came up in the last talk. It was quite interesting listening to that talk because it kind of leads in a lot of ways to what I'm going to say here. The perennial philosophy comes originally from the ideas of the alchemists. Now, the central tenet of the alchemists was a principle known as solve coagula, the Latin for dissolve, dissipate, and bind. So the synthesis that the last speaker was talking about was actually already included in the perennial philosophy of the alchemists. Now the reason why I mention the alchemists is because Mesmer, from which the art of mesmerism derives, was most certainly of that ilk. So many people these days are familiar with hypnotism and its various related disciplines, such as NLP and stage hypnosis and various forms of therapeutic hypnosis. But the thing is that a lot of people are actually not familiar with where these disciplines originally derive. Most people have heard of the word mesmerism, but they haven't actually, they maybe don't connect the word mesmerism to the fact that there was actually Franz Anton Mesmer. So basically, the origins of what we now call clinical hypnotherapy, there's many schools of hypnotherapy out there. They very rarely actually teach their students the origins of their profession. The word hypnotism actually derived from a gentleman called James Braid. James Braid was a gentleman in Manchester in 1884 who was an ophthalmist and also an expert on the muscular system. He basically had been studying a travelling mesmerist known as Charles Le Fontaine, who had come over to England to demonstrate the art of mesmerism. What happened was that Braid took the thing as a case study. Being an ophthalmist and, as I mentioned, a physician of types, he took the principles of, say, for example, light in the eyes and these kinds of things as being the working principles behind what was actually taking place. So this is hence all the shiny objects and things swinging in people's faces and disorientation from visual cues and so on. Now Mesmer believed in a principle called the vital fluid, the universal fluid. Mesmerism is also known as animal magnetism. Well, there's many reasons for that. Animal magnetism is actually something which comes from the vital force, which runs through the animal kingdom, in which human beings pretty much belong. So here, this particular slide demonstrates the movements of the vital fluid. And the subject here has wide open eyes, which is one of the actual side effects of mesmerism, is that the gaze is usually locked into position. After Mesmer came a gentleman called Puisiger, Marquis de Puisiger. He developed the ideas of Mesmer a little further. He didn't quite believe in the universal fluid in the same way as Mesmer himself, which was a kind of vital force being transmitted between subject and object. What he did, though, was actually work the principles of mesmerism that Mesmer had laid out and created the conditions which later, in clinical hypnosis and other disciplines, named after Braid, it was after all Braid who came up with the name of hypnotism, after the god of sleep, Hypnos. And Poiseuille worked with the principle of somnambulism. He created somnambulism, which was obviously comes from sleeping as well. La Fontaine basically then came after Poiseuille and then taught Braid himself. So this is there was a definite intermingling between the mystical origins of hypnosis and the current day form of therapeutic hypnosis. So we had Braid in the 1880s. We then also, in England, as well as Braid, we had Esdale. And in the First World War, Esdale was posted in Calcutta. Here, he actually operated the principles of mesmerism on patients, curing them of what is now known as PTSD. But in those days, it was called shell shock. So he worked with them, working for long hours, working with a Poiseuillean method of gentle passes over the patient until they fell into a state of somnambulism. And this took a very, very long time. In England as well, we also had Dr. Elliotson in the 1880s, who had a magazine called The Zoist, which worked with the principles of mesmerism. What is interesting about Dr. Elliotson is that he also had he was also one of the founders of UCL. And he worked there right from its very inception, working on every patient he could basically work with. And he continued this for a very, very long time. This is a slide of Mesmer's grave. And as you can see, on Mesmer's grave, it's a triangular thing which stands at waist height. That's a sundial on the top. On one side, it's got the planetary orbits. On this side, it has a radiated eye in the triangle. Now this obviously connects Mesmer to, well, quite a few ancient traditions, one might say. And those ancient traditions are actually quite interesting because they are indeed related to the ancient Egyptian sleep temples. This may sound incredible to some, but this is nonetheless the case. The sleep temples were also magnetic temples. They created conditions of somnambulism, magnetism, which is another form of mesmerism, and it was rooted in the Egyptian tradition. Now, what's very interesting is that as this came from Egypt, it moved into Naples. And in Naples, there's even to this day a little testimony to a colony of Egyptians that actually located themselves in Naples and named a square Little Nile Square, which is known as that to this day. In this day, there's a new resurgence of mesmerism. I mean, quite a while ago, we had a film, I think it came out in the mid-90s, I can't remember exactly when. And in the mid-90s, we had this film with Alan Rickman starring as Mesmer. And, well, if you're interested in this subject, it's worth a watch, but it's a bit of a romanticised kind of viewpoint on the whole situation, and a bit sensationalist, you might say. Mesmerism tends to create quite a lot of adverse reactions as a subject through history. Here is a slide of Poiseuille, who I spoke of before, Marquis de Poiseuille, who came pretty much directly after Mesmer. Here we have to link all of these ideas together, we have the card of Le Monde, the world, which is also known as the universe and various other titles in various other tarot systems. The reason why I put up this particular card, for those who are familiar with Alessandro Jodorowsky and his specific views on the tarot system, there's one very special point that Alessandro Jodorowsky makes of this particular card. And that specific point is that the final atu, as it's called in the tarot, symbolises the completion in the major arcana. This completion is actually the synthesis, to bring us back to our original thing, the synthesis of all. The synthesis, no longer the division. This synthesis is actually a state of pure presence, of pure being. And so therefore, there is no longer any division between subject and object. One may actually call this the actual aim of the entire system of the perennial philosophy as it stands.